The Galactic Empire had stood unchallenged for over 10,000 years. It was a vast and unyielding machine, built upon the ruins of countless civilizations that had dared to resist its rule. It did not negotiate. It did not compromise. It conquered, absorbed, and crushed any species that stood in its way. Its armadas stretched across the stars, fleets of world killers patrolling the void like celestial gods. Entire planetary systems bowed before them, their people reduced to vassals, their cultures erased, their histories rewritten to glorify the Empire. The hierarchy was absolute, a chain of command stretching from the highest echelons of the imperial court to the lowest slave caste. When the Empire's scouts first detected Earth, they saw nothing remarkable. A primitive world, a young species, barely clawing its way into space. Their energy output was laughable, their technology crude, their military a mere speck compared to the planetary war machines of the Empire. The humans, it seemed, had yet to be introduced to true power. An emissary was sent, an envoy of the Empire's will, draped in the regalia of a conqueror. The terms were simple: humanity would surrender unconditionally. They would dismantle their governments, dissolve their military, and pledge eternal fealty to the Empire. In return, they would be granted existence, stripped of sovereignty, of course, but alive. The response was not what the Empire expected. Humanity declined. It was not an act of arrogance or bravado. It was simply stated, without fanfare, without grandstanding. No. The envoy was baffled. No species had ever refused outright. Some fought and lost, others bargained for time, but outright rejection? That was unheard of. It was as if these humans did not comprehend the sheer scale of what they faced. The Empire did not waste time with second warnings. The first wave of warships arrived in orbit within days, hovering above Earth like silent gods, weapons primed. The first strike was meant to be a demonstration, a single city, erased in an instant, reduced to molten rubble as a warning to the rest. But something strange happened. The moment the Empire's warships powered their weapons, their systems flickered. Shields dropped. Communications scrambled. The lead dreadnought, the Valkyrie, suffered a catastrophic systems failure. It drifted powerless for mere seconds, enough for Earth's defenses, rudimentary as they were, to launch a counterattack. And that was the first mistake. The Empire did not expect resistance. They did not expect surface-based weapons to target a disabled warship with pinpoint precision. They did not expect coordinated strikes against their landing parties before they had even fully deployed. What they had expected was capitulation. Instead, they got war. Humanity fought like no species the Empire had ever encountered. They fought without hesitation, without fear, and without regard for the overwhelming disparity in power. Guerrilla warfare erupted across every occupied region. Cities were turned into death traps. Civilian centers were abandoned and repurposed into ambush sites. Even as Imperial forces established beachheads, they found themselves under constant, unrelenting assault. This was not resistance. This was a hunt. Every attempt to establish order was met with chaos. Convoys disappeared. Supply lines were sabotaged. Entire battalions were wiped out without a trace. The Empire deployed shock troops, elite warriors trained to pacify even the most stubborn insurgencies, but they fared no better. Humans did not fight for territory. They did not fight for power. They fought to make the Empire bleed. Reports from the ground were concerning, then disturbing, then outright horrifying. Humans had no fear of death. They adapted with terrifying speed. Imperial tactics that had worked flawlessly for centuries were dismantled in mere weeks. Standard pacification protocols became useless. Cities that were conquered one day were lost the next. And then the Empire made its second mistake. They escalated. Entire regions were razed to the ground. Civilian populations were targeted en masse. Orbital bombardments turned continents into wastelands. The Empire did what it always did: crush resistance until nothing remained. But even as the world burned, the humans did not break. For every city reduced to ash, the attacks grew more ferocious. For every village destroyed, another fleet mysteriously disappeared. The humans did not mourn. They did not waver. They did not beg for mercy. They only fought harder. It became clear that Earth itself would not last. The Empire had the firepower to turn it into a lifeless rock, and they were prepared to do so. But destroying a planet was not victory. It was the beginning of something far worse. The moment it became clear that Earth would fall, humanity sent out a message. Not to the Empire, but to the galaxy. A simple transmission, encoded in every major frequency, hijacking Imperial channels, bypassing even their most secure networks. It was not a plea for help. It was not a request for mercy. It was a warning. And it began with 4 words that sent a shiver down the spine of every ruler, every general, every being who had ever heard of humanity's defiance. Run for your lives. The war had entered a new phase. The Empire had expected swift subjugation, but instead, they found themselves trapped in an unending nightmare. Earth was a battlefield where every inch of ground had to be fought for, and every step forward came with a cost. The initial invasion had been meant as a show of force, a calculated demonstration of overwhelming might. Now, it had devolved into something the Empire had never encountered before, an endless, grinding war of attrition. Humanity refused to meet the enemy in open battle. They knew they could not stand toe-to-toe with the Empire's war machines, nor could they hope to match the sheer scale of the invaders' forces. So, they adapted. They became ghosts, striking from the shadows and vanishing before the enemy could retaliate. They did not fight for victory in a conventional sense. They fought to drag the Empire into hell with them. Imperial forces learned quickly that their standard methods of planetary conquest were useless. Cities that had once been taken with a single overwhelming strike turned into death traps where every alley, every building, every sewer tunnel was a battlefield. The humans did not hold positions. They let the enemy take ground, then bled them dry with relentless ambushes. Every street taken required the sacrifice of entire squads. Every secured sector was never truly safe. Supply lines were attacked with ruthless precision. Convoys disappeared, their escorts disabled by explosives or relentless sniper fire. Even high-altitude transport ships found themselves under siege, shot down by hidden anti-aircraft positions or hijacked mid-flight by human operatives who had somehow managed to infiltrate Imperial bases. The losses were staggering. The Empire responded with orbital bombardments, leveling entire regions in an effort to deny the enemy ground to fight from. It didn't matter. The humans were never where they were expected to be. For every settlement burned to the ground, the resistance only became more vicious. They did not mourn their dead, they avenged them. What disturbed the Empire most was the sheer level of coordination. This was not a species reacting blindly to conquest. It was as if they had been preparing for this war long before the first Imperial warship arrived in their system. Military leaders who had crushed 100 worlds suddenly found themselves facing an opponent they could not predict. Every tactical adjustment was met with an immediate counter. Every change in formation or supply structure was exploited before it could even be properly implemented. It was as if the humans had memorized the Empire's entire doctrine before the war had even begun. The Empire began deploying cyber warfare units to shut down human communication networks. It was a disaster. Human resistance cells operated on decentralized, hardened systems that the Empire could not override. Worse, their own systems were being infiltrated. Supply orders were falsified, causing reinforcements to be sent into the wrong sectors. Entire divisions were stranded, their navigation systems corrupted, their drop pods sent plummeting into the ocean or deep into enemy territory. And then, without warning, Imperial ships began disappearing. Not just the smaller transports or individual patrols, but fully armed cruisers, battleships, even capital-class warships. Some vanished without a trace. Others were found adrift, their crews missing, their command logs wiped. The Empire suspected sabotage, but there was no explanation for how the humans could be boarding heavily guarded ships in deep space. Morale began to collapse. There were whispers among the Empire's soldiers, rumors of something worse than war. The humans were not just fighting back, they were learning, evolving. Every mistake the Empire made was never repeated. Every failed attack turned into the foundation for a new, more devastating strategy. It was not the desperate resistance of a dying species. It was something else entirely. The Empire doubled its efforts, deploying its most advanced war machines, its deadliest warriors, its most feared executioners. It did not matter. The humans adapted. They built countermeasures within days. They turned the Empire's own weapons against them, using captured equipment to infiltrate enemy lines. They developed new tactics faster than the Empire could analyze them. They weren't just surviving. They were outpacing one of the oldest, most advanced civilizations in the known galaxy. The casualties reached unprecedented levels. What had been planned as a rapid occupation turned into a meat grinder. Imperial generals, once regarded as legends, fell one by one, their fleets reduced to wreckage, their armies consumed by a war that refused to end. The humans were not invincible. They suffered, they lost, but every loss only fueled their fire. They fought not as a species desperate to survive, but as one utterly unwilling to accept the idea of defeat. The Empire's high command refused to acknowledge the severity of the situation. They believed that it was only a matter of time before humanity was broken. But those on the front lines knew better. This war had taken on a life of its own. The longer it dragged on, the more it became clear that even if the Empire burned every last human world, even if they shattered their armies and tore their civilization apart, it would not end. The humans had turned their defiance into something greater than survival. They had turned it into a weapon, and they had no intention of putting it down. The war had started as an invasion. Now, it had become something far worse. The Empire had underestimated humanity. What should have been a simple conquest had turned into a never-ending cycle of losses. The longer the war stretched on, the clearer it became that the humans were not fighting to win in the traditional sense. They were fighting to ensure that the Empire suffered, that every advance came at a price too steep to bear. It was not just their adaptability that made them dangerous. It was their ability to turn every setback into an advantage. The destruction of their cities did not demoralize them. It removed targets, leaving nothing but open ground for guerrilla warfare. The loss of their military installations did not cripple them. It forced them to decentralize, making them impossible to eliminate in a single decisive strike. No matter what the Empire destroyed, the humans only grew stronger. The war was no longer confined to Earth. Human forces had spread beyond their homeworld, infiltrating Imperial-controlled space with terrifying efficiency. Ships that should have been untouchable were being hijacked from within. Entire fleets vanished in deep space, only for their wreckage to be found drifting, burned from the inside out. The Empire's own supply chains were being severed, their logistical networks collapsing under relentless sabotage. What made it worse was that the Empire still had no idea how humans were doing it. Imperial war doctrine relied on superior numbers and overwhelming force, but that was meaningless against an enemy that refused to fight on those terms. Even the most fortified Imperial outposts found themselves compromised, their security measures rendered useless. It was clear that the humans had learned the Empire's technology at an alarming rate. Captured ships, stolen weapons, intercepted transmissions, each one became a piece of the puzzle, and the humans were assembling it faster than the Empire could react. Their weapons, once outdated and crude, were now capable of piercing even the most advanced Imperial armor. Their fighters, once primitive compared to the sleek designs of the Empire's fleets, had been modified beyond recognition, their agility and firepower now rivaling that of the Empire's best. The fear among the Imperial ranks was no longer just about losing battles. It was about what the humans had become. There was no arrogance left among the invaders, no belief that victory was inevitable. Every attempt to reinforce their presence only resulted in more losses. The humans had turned the war into something the Empire had never experienced, a war where the cost of winning was indistinguishable from the cost of losing. Even the Empire's mightiest warships, symbols of their unchallenged rule, were no longer safe. Reports surfaced of entire crews found dead without a single shot fired. Ships went dark mid-transit, their distress signals broadcasting only silence. Boarding teams sent to investigate returned with frantic messages of corridors littered with bodies, of systems overridden with no trace of the perpetrators. Whatever was happening, it was beyond the scope of normal warfare. The humans were no longer just fighting for survival. They were waging psychological war. Imperial commanders who had once stood at the helm of armadas were now paralyzed by fear, unable to trust their own ships, their own defenses. The humans had made it clear there would be no safe harbor, no place untouched by the conflict. For the first time in its history, the Empire faced an enemy it could not break. Other species had resisted, but they had always fallen in time. There had always been a point where they surrendered, where the realization of inevitable defeat forced them to kneel. That moment never came with the humans. The more the Empire tried to escalate, the worse it became. The destruction of entire colonies did not deter them. The slaughter of civilians did not weaken their resolve. If anything, it made them more ruthless. They did not forget, and they did not forgive. Every act of brutality was repaid tenfold. It was no longer a question of military superiority. The Empire still had the numbers, the firepower, the technology. But none of that mattered if they could not control the battlefield, if they could not anticipate their enemy's next move. Humanity had dragged them into a type of war they were utterly unprepared for, and there was no way out. The Empire had fought countless wars before, but never one like this. Never against an enemy who refused to yield, who fought not for territory or power but for the sole purpose of ensuring that their enemies suffered. The realization was setting in. This was not a temporary resistance. It was not an insurgency that could be crushed with time. The humans were not just fighting back. They were ensuring that even if the Empire won, it would be a victory soaked in blood, a hollow triumph that left them broken beyond repair. The war had changed. It was no longer about conquest. It was about survival, not for humanity, but for the Empire itself. The Empire had never known fear. It had spread across the galaxy for millennia, expanding without question, crushing resistance without mercy. Its enemies had always broken, their final moments filled with pleas for mercy, for surrender, for an end to the suffering. But this war had given the Empire something it had never encountered, an opponent that did not beg, did not break, and did not stop. Humanity had not just resisted. They had turned the war into something the Empire could no longer control. Entire sectors were slipping from Imperial hands. What had once been stable systems were now war zones, filled with unrest and insurrection. The longer the war raged, the more species took notice. The Empire had believed that humanity would fight alone, that no one would dare rise against their rule. But now, cracks were forming in their dominion. Rebellions erupted across occupied worlds, inspired by humanity's defiance. The sight of an empire struggling against a single species shattered the illusion of invincibility. If the humans could fight, if they could endure, then perhaps others could as well. The Empire's forces, once spread across the stars to maintain order, were now being pulled into a war they could not afford to lose. Every soldier sent to Earth was a soldier taken away from suppressing growing dissent elsewhere. The fear that had begun as whispers among the Empire's troops had spread to its leadership. Reports from the front lines no longer spoke of battles won or objectives secured. They spoke of losses, of disappearing fleets, of entire planets going dark. It was no longer about how to defeat humanity. It was about how to survive them. The Empire had always relied on its technological superiority, on its overwhelming numbers. But those advantages were becoming meaningless. Humanity was not just adapting, they were outpacing them. The weapons the Empire had once used to impose its will were now turned against them. Human forces no longer fought with desperation but with precision, with knowledge of every imperial weakness. They had studied the Empire's war doctrine, broken its strategies, and reshaped the battlefield into something the Empire no longer understood. There were reports of Imperial command centers being infiltrated with no sign of forced entry, of officers found executed in the most secure locations in the galaxy. No stronghold was safe. No fortress was impenetrable. The war had become more than a battle for planets. It had become a psychological nightmare, where every Imperial soldier knew that at any moment, the enemy could be among them. Desertion rates soared. Entire regiments abandoned their posts, fearing that staying meant certain death. The Empire had always maintained control through fear, but fear was a weapon that could be turned against them. Now they were the ones who hesitated. They were the ones who second-guessed every order, every movement, every shadow. The humans had made it clear that they were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting to ensure the Empire would never recover. The cost of war was no longer measured in resources or territory but in the irreversible damage done to the Empire's very foundation. They were bleeding, and the bleeding would not stop. The final phase of the war had begun, but it was not humanity that was struggling to endure. It was the Empire. For the first time, the question was not whether the humans would survive, but whether the Empire would. The Empire had reached the breaking point. What had begun as a campaign of conquest had become a desperate struggle for survival. The momentum that once carried them across the stars had vanished, replaced by exhaustion, paranoia, and the growing realization that there was no way to win. The humans had not just resisted, they had systematically dismantled the very foundation of the Empire's power. What remained of the Imperial war machine was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Supply lines were beyond repair, manufacturing hubs had gone dark, and recruitment had collapsed. The once mighty fleets that had blackened the skies above countless worlds were now graveyards, floating ruins serving as grim warnings to those still loyal to the Empire. Those who remained knew the truth. This war was no longer about victory. It was about escaping the nightmare humanity had created for them. Desperation had led to drastic measures. High Command had ordered mass retreats from every front, abandoning colonies that had stood under imperial rule for centuries. There was no choice. Every occupied world had become hostile territory, its people emboldened by the war's undeniable shift. The mere presence of the Empire's forces was enough to incite resistance. Soldiers sent to restore order found themselves hunted, unable to tell friend from foe. The Empire had never feared rebellion before, but this was different. It was not a scattered uprising, not an isolated problem. It was a fire spreading across every sector, fueled by the knowledge that the invincible Empire could be wounded. Even the highest echelons of command were unraveling. Generals had begun abandoning their posts, fleeing to the outer reaches of the galaxy in the hopes of escaping the war's inevitable conclusion. The Emperor himself, once regarded as an untouchable figure of absolute authority, had vanished from the public eye. Some believed he had fled, others suspected he had been assassinated, but in the end, it no longer mattered. The Empire was leaderless, directionless, held together only by remnants of loyalty that were rapidly eroding. Humanity, however, did not stop. The war had become more than just retribution. It was a statement. They had been underestimated, dismissed as another species to be conquered, but now they stood as the architects of the Empire's ruin. There was no diplomacy, no negotiation, no offers of peace. The humans had made their decision. The Empire would not be allowed to retreat and lick its wounds. Their final message to the remnants of imperial rule was clear. There would be no rebuilding, no resurgence. The Empire had made one fatal mistake. It had come to Earth expecting to break a species that did not know how to lose. Now, the only thing left for them was to run. To flee as far as they could and pray that humanity's wrath did not follow. For those who remained, the horror was only beginning. The humans had not simply fought back. They had proven that the Empire was nothing more than a fragile illusion, a force that could be broken like any other. And in the end, that truth was more devastating than any battle lost. The war was over. But the fear of humanity would never fade.